All right. We are here today at the home of Lois Carson to interview her for the Bridges That Carried Us Over archive. And I'm Jennifer Tilton, and here with Romaine Washington to ask her some questions about the civil rights movement and her memories of San Bernardino. So to get started, first maybe can you tell us about some of your early memories when you first moved to San Bernardino? What do you remember about the community when you first moved here?
Well, I'll start with, I was working at, I went to college in Ohio, got a job at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and as an aside, I was part of the first group that worked on machines for technology as opposed to human computers. You've read the book Hidden Figures? Well, I didn't realize that in 1950, when I got that job, we were the first group of people to work on machines as opposed to human computers. And I was one of 50 people, only 2 females in the group that got hired in that wave. That job transferred me here to Norton. And that's how I came to California. I brought my grandmother with me because my son back there was a year old, and she watched him while I worked because I didn't realize I was going to be transferred. Anyway, we lived in some housing that had been military housing out on 3rd near Waterman. Yeah. And from there, we moved to the west side. And this is the second home I've had on the west side of San Bernardino. This is San Bernardino. Yes. The next street over is Rialto. And what I remember mostly is that there were the only professional people that I got to know when I first came were Dorothy Ingram and her brother, who was a doctor. Everybody else had, worked in manual labor, and a couple of other people who were transferred when I was here were the next kind of professional people to come in to the area. There was a lot of discrimination in those days. We're talking 1952 in the early 50s. And most of the blacks lived out in the Valley Truck Farm, way out east on the other side of Waterman, where Hospitality Lane and all that is now. Right. That used to all be blacks, and people farmed and all of that out there then. There was an all-black school. Dorothy Ingram was the principal, and since it was not part of the San Bernardino Unified School District, they made her one little school a district, and she became the superintendent of a one school district. The state finally realized that that was open discrimination, so they put it in the San Bernardino Unified, and she became an assistant superintendent at that point. Yeah. No, they didn't make her a superintendent. They busted her back to principal. Of that one school that was now in the district. So those are some of my early memories.
Where did you first move on the west side, and what was the west side community like then?
I moved on 16th Street, and we integrated that street because I'm Catholic and I started going to St. Anthony Church there. So we saw a house for sale and it was close to the church. Seemed like a really good idea. So we talked the lady who was selling them into selling us the home. And the little kids next door told my kids the dogs didn't even like black people. Wow. But we made it out. We became friends with the neighbors. But in time, it turned black.
Do you remember more about that process? Kind of how fast was the process of kind of white flight out of the neighborhood?
Well, block busting.
Yeah.
Realtors came in, scared the white people who lived there, and then lured black people into moving, and they didn't know they were part of a block busting campaign. So that's how it happens everywhere.
Yeah. And
but
that's
it didn't really matter that much to me then. I wanted to be near the church, so
that worked, right?
And I didn't really understand block busting till I came here, because we moved here and it was in the process of being block busted. And a white woman from 6th Street came here and sat down with me and said, we already have 2 black families on this street. Can we sell you one that looks like this on another street. I said, lady, when I'm spending this kind of money, nobody shops for me, and I'm staying right here.
Wow.
And but we really fought. She and I started working together with other people in the community to try to reverse the blockbusting that was going on, but we lost that battle.
Yeah. What year did you move out here?
1966.
1966.
I've been here over 60 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you remember any of the kind of real estate agents who were involved in that process? And did
I
you
probably got her name on the paperwork, but I'd have to look that up
Yeah.
because I got it.
Yeah.
Got all the paperwork from buying this house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you first moved to 16th, did you get to know kind of the rest of the black community on the west side
Well, as it grew into a black community, yes. And then they built new housing near the church, and all of that was sold to black people. And everything west of what is now Medical Center Drive, that was all farmland. Yeah, because the kids used to go up to the farm, and the man would chase them out, and
Yeah.
you know. But they loved going there. It was like adventure, you know.
Are there any sort of neighborhood businesses you remembered from that early time in the 50s over on the west side? Or anything about, like where the Ingrams lived and the two churches were on kind of 6th and Harris, that area seemed to be like an early
That's
center.
south of Baseline. I was north of Baseline,
yeah.
so I didn't really go down there a lot.
Yeah.
But the west side, when we were raising the kids there, had a bank, had a Safeway market. My kids had Christmas savings at the bank. They had their own little savings account. There were businesses along Mount Vernon. It was a very viable street at that time, and we watched all of that go away. There were a few black businesses. I remember Jerry's Velvet Lounge. Very nice nightclub environment, and NCNW and Les Unamis used to have activities there, and but that went by the wayside. And up on Highland, this guy had another nice lounge. Can't think of his name right now, but it was a very nice place too. That the name might come to me.
Okay, great. And when you first moved here, who were some of the older community leaders who you came to get to know?
Here?
Yeah, here.
Well, we spent a lot of time working against blockbusting. Ella Honeycutt was the woman who wanted me to move somewhere else so this street would retain only two black families. But there weren't a lot of leaders in the early days because people were moving in. Everybody had small children, and that was the priority. And my leadership with others in the community started in working with the school district, because there again we had to fight against prejudice in the school. My son was they were in Catholic school first.
That's where I went to see him.
And when we moved here, he went to Aquinas, but I put all the kids in the Rialto schools. And I only had him there for a year because he ran into prejudice there. And I thought, why should I pay for prejudice? I can get that free at Eisenhower. So I took him out, put him in Eisenhower, and we really ran into a lot of it because they just weren't used to black kids. The police would stop him every day walking home from school. You know, past a certain street, I think it was Pepper. Then they started harassing any black kids, and most of them came from this area that was being blockbusted. He had a teacher who was a member of the John Birch Society. When my husband and I went to sit down and talk with him about Harry in the class, he took out his John Birch Society little statue or something, set it right on the desk in front of us, and the next day I got Harry out of that class.
Wow.
But that's the kind of things that we ran into. But Lorna Carey and her husband, who was an officer at Norton, they became part of the group working against any kind of racism in the Rialto School District. But most of my civil rights stuff was done in the San Bernardino area.
How'd you get involved in that in San Bernardino? What kind of brought you into those networks to start doing that work?
Well, it was just my mother was a person that was active in community, and it was so obvious. And the Martin Luther King, that got me started. I went into LA to see him at the First AME Church and came back, and we got started with that. And we had lots of marches. And I had all my children, 2 in the stroller, 2 hanging onto the sides of the stroller, and my oldest son. And this woman said, "Why are you out here with all these little children?" I said, "Well, I want them to know that their parents were in the struggle."
Now, were you part of the NAACP at that time also?
There was no NAACP yet. That came a little later.
Okay.
That came after the Community League of Mothers and the West Side Action Group.
Okay.
West Side Action Group was founded by Bob
Parker.
Parker. Bob Parker.
I want to go back a little bit to the Les Jeunes Amis. Where did you guys come up with that?
Well, when I was in high school, Catholic school in Memphis, Tennessee, that's where I grew up, I started a little club and I called it the Naviette Debs. I didn't know that word was naive. I had seen it in a book and it sounded good. So when I proposed that we have a little social organization, because there weren't many organizations to join. Here, we called it Les Jeunes Amis, the Young Friends.
Yes.
And when we were all around 34, 35, the NCNW came in. A woman came out from Pasadena and talked with a bunch of us about the NCNW. And we kind of voted to disband the Les Jeunes Amis and join this new organization, which was national.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we started our own section here. So our section here is about 53 years old.
Can you tell us more about Les Jeunes Amis and kind of who else was involved in that early on that you remember and what you all did?
Well, the only person that is still around is Faye Pointer, who is on the Foundation for Valley College now. She was a member. Madeline Brown now lives in Santa Clarita. She lives in, and they're the only two that I still have connections to. The others, some of them were military wives, so they left because of that. And Penny Cole, she passed away. A number of them have passed away.
Yes.
Penny Cole was Richard Cole's wife, is that right?
That's right. Penny Cole was with, and trying to think of some of the others. If I had the picture, and there is one picture down at NCNW, because of the movement disbanding that group to go to NCNW, that's part of NCNW's history as well. So there's a picture of the group that's in the NCNW office down there.
And you decided on French because it sounded good?
Yeah, you know, I was young, and I just picked up where I left off in high school once I found out how to speak a little French.
And so what are some of the activities you all did with Les Jeunes Amis?
Every year we had a cotton ball. We gave a scholarship. I'm trying to think of Dolores Key was one of our queens of the cotton ball, and Clark, what was her name? There were a number of, we had a queen every year in the cotton ball, and we did community work, a lot of community stuff.
So what was a cotton ball like? Since we can't go back, we weren't there. Can you describe what it was like?
People came dressed up, it was formal, and we had the contests and activities for the girls who ran, and we had to identify young men who would escort them in, similar to a debutante
I was
ball.
going to say, it sounds
But
like
it was,
a debutante
yeah,
ball
but we
before
called it
that.
a cotton ball. And that was an idea that came from Memphis.
That's what I thought,
Yeah.
cotton,
My mother had been involved with something like that.
Yes,
And so you talked about some early other organizations that, or people who started to get together to work against the blockbusting and work in the schools. Tell us a little bit more about how you all got together and what organizations kind of came up
Well,
early on?
there was no other organization that joined in the blockbusting
Right.
activity. They were all people who lived here on the bench.
Right.
But there were other organizations at that time. The Gay Anns, that was a group of women called themselves the Gay Anns.
The gay aunt.
The Gay Anns.
Henry Hooks has a beautiful picture of them.
Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
And later on, sororities came in.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm an AKA.
Yeah, I know.
That came in '61. And the Deltas, and Sherelle was a Delta. I don't remember exactly when they started, but they go back to those, I would say, 60s,
Okay.
back to
Yeah.
the 60s.
Yeah, yeah.
There was a time, I believe your aunt was a Zeta.
Oh, I didn't know
I
that.
believe Mary was a member of the Zetas, I think.
Oh, I'm gonna.
She and Betty Anderson.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
Betty Anderson was a city councilwoman.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is she still alive, Betty Anderson?
Yeah, she's still alive.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. Huh.
So, lots of questions. You mentioned there were a lot of protests, right? That you remember taking your kids to protests. What are some of those early protests you remember?
Mostly against the school district. None of them were about housing.
Right.
Some of them were protests to be visible,
Yes.
so that the majority and the power structure would know that we're here and we're not going to just be silent, you know. And they were that kind of protest in union with things that were going on nationally or statewide, or if they were going on in Los Angeles, we used to replicate a lot of things out this way.
Yeah. Do you remember how CORE first developed out here? Because I see that sort of by 1963 or so, there's a CORE chapter.
Richard Cole's brother started
Okay.
CORE. My husband might have been a little involved with CORE, but I don't remember a lot about it.
Yeah.
I just know that they were there, and they definitely were focused on civil rights.
Yes.
That was their only reason for existence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, you talked about some of the school activism on the West Side that the mothers were involved in. What are some of your memories of some of
And
those?
they were involved in housing segregation, school segregation, any kind of segregation.
Yeah.
And they were confrontational, and my husband was right there with them, and we just decided, as I said, I would watch the children because they were so confrontational, they could get arrested. So I did not go to any of those. One of us had to be here.
Right. What did he tell you about some of those protests that he went to at the school board? And
Oh, what people would say to them, the name calling, dragging people off when they wouldn't move, and but fortunately, he came close, but they never took him to jail.
I have a question about Woolworths. Did anything happen at Woolworths as far as protests or? Because I remember Cheryl Brown mentioned that.
Something did, but I can't remember exactly. It seems that there had been an incident that occurred there, and I don't remember what it was, but they decided to picket it.
Yes.
Yeah. But I don't remember what the incident was.
Okay. Maybe it's
And there was a judge who was very interested in civil rights, and he used to be a part of any group that was fighting prejudice and segregation. Judge, it almost came to me. But he was a very wealthy man, lived out on the north end of San Bernardino. Yeah, it'll come to me, but he was very involved with that. So it was nice to have white support.
Yes.
Yeah. And a judge at that.
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. And Erna Schulin and Walt Schulin, he was a teacher at Valley College. They were both, she was head of the League of Women Voters. And that's how I got involved with League, and I've been a member ever since. But she and Walt were involved. Walt actually went down to Mississippi to work in the Mississippi Project.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so integrated groups, that's what the judge and Walt and black folk were involved in. And then when the school district decided after all of the protests, they had a vacancy, so they named John Woods to the vacancy, thinking that he would do what they wanted. We met at Hardy Brown's house, and we decided we're going to support him and we're going to take him back from them and we're going to support him and make him our representative. And that's exactly what happened.
That was wise. That was a good strategy.
That's the kind of political stuff we dealt in all the time. We were always scheming. What can we do?
Oh, and talking about that, the presence of the KKK that would pop up periodically. Do you have any?
Founded in Fontana.
I know.
Yeah.
Do you have any memories?
I never had any interaction with them. I know they had a house up on where Community Hospital is now. That house is on the corner of 19th, and they used to be there. And then it went to the motorcycle group.
Hells Angels.
Hells Angels.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So right there in San Bernardino, the KKK owned a house?
They were, I don't know if they owned it, but they were in that house
were in
before
that
the Hells Angels. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there were so many whites here from Oklahoma and Texas. They brought all of that with them. And the swimming pool, at that time there was no pool on the west side. So everybody went to Paris Hill Park, and there was always a problem until they built the one on 5th Street.
Right.
Yeah.
When did they build the one on 5th Street?
I don't remember the exact year, but I would say my oldest son was probably about 8 or 10 or something like that when they did it.
So was it late 60s, early 70s?
I would say it was mid-60s, somewhere in there, I'm not sure.
So what kind of problems would happen up at Paris Hill Park? Just fights, like name calling?
Not so much fights, but name calling and just the tension of knowing that something could happen, or that they would call your children names. But I always went with my kids, so, keep them.
Yeah, you wouldn't send them by themselves. That actually raises a little bit of a question. That pool was first integrated, I understand, in the late 40s, I think, because of Mexican-American mobilization. And I sort of wondered if there were any collaborations between Mexican-American West Side organizers against racism and African-American networks.
Well, they never collaborated that I can recall for political purposes that I recall until much later. But they were always integrated in the neighborhood. Because my best friends were, and being Catholic, there were a lot of them in my church. But on 16th Street, I had all Mexican neighbors on both sides, across the street, and I taught them how to make sweet potato pie. They let me help make tamales, and somebody visited from Mexico and wanted the recipe for the sweet potato pie, and it was just a lot of fun. And I learned to make enchiladas.
But in terms of like the political networks, they weren't so involved.
Not at that point.
Not at that point, right.
They were not as awake as we were. That came later.
Later, right.
When they saw the success we were having in achieving goals.
Yeah.
And they did work closely, but not to the extent that they were working together in other places.
Yeah.
And we supported the Cesar Chavez movement and all of that.
Yeah.
Because it was in our interest to work together.
Absolutely, yeah. Can you share any other memories of someone like Frances Grice or Valerie Pope or Bonnie Johnson? Those are
Bonnie
folks
Johnson was one of the League of Mothers.
So the League of Mothers, they're all gone. So
they're all gone.
We're sort of hoping that maybe you can share stories. Yeah.
There was some tension because Frances particularly did not like college-bred women. She felt very intimidated, and I tried to be a bridge for her to work with women, but she hated the idea of working with women who had college degrees. Valerie, not so much. And Bonnie had a business, so she did not feel, and she had grown up here, so she was different. But, and Frances was clearly the leader, and what she objected to made others object. And I had a meeting here at my house to bring some of these college-educated women together with Frances and some of her ladies, And it began to break down at that point.
Wow.
Yeah. That was her own personal nemesis. And it wasn't anything that anybody had done to her. You know.
Yeah. And what about Art Townsend? What do you remember about him as a
I
sort of
used
leader
to,
in
I
those
wrote
days?
for Art Townsend's first paper, the Precinct Reporter.
Yes.
And my column was Carson's Candor. He wanted me to write about social stuff. I wanted to write about civic stuff. And eventually that's what I did. And I actually got a letter from Congressman Alan, what was his name, from San Francisco? I can't remember right now. But anyway, that showed Art Townsend that I was on the right track. But I wrote for him for a long time, and until I got elected to the college board, and because I wanted the college board to do business with the paper, I stopped writing for the paper. I didn't want any conflict of interest discussion.
Yeah. So what was Art Townsend like as a man, as a leader in the community?
He was, male dominance was, I would say, was part of his character. He always was pretty reasonable with me. He told me what he wanted, and I told him what I wanted, and I won. And he was respected by some people, but others not so much. And a lot of that had to do with, I knew his first wife, and he had 2 wives and two sets of children, 2 boys and a girl in both of them. Brian and Mary, I mean his daughter Yolanda and Michael on one side, Rosalind and Gregory and what was the other boy's name on the other side. And Mitzi, his first wife, was my neighbor and my friend. But all of that took care of itself over time, you know.
So what were some, besides
When he
the
ran
marriage?
when he ran against Norris Gregory, that showed what side people were on.
Right.
I did not necessarily choose a side, but I could see he was not going to win against Norris because there was something in the community, and I think it had to do with the 2 wives
I see.
that kind of defeated him.
I see. I see.
But otherwise, he did a lot of good stuff
Yeah.
in the community. I remember he urged my husband and me to buy some property in Paris. Blacks were buying property in Paris at that time. But with 6 children, we didn't think we had enough money to do that. I wish I had now. But that's the kind of relationship that we had.
You mentioned the sort of male-dominated. What were the sort of gender relations in local politics like? Is that one of the reasons you kind of started CNW?
Oh, I
to
ran
create?
into that a lot
Yeah.
because I was always pushing the envelope. When I decided to run for the college board, I went to talk to the West Side Action Group, and they said, well, Mrs. Carson, it should be a man running. I said, well, where is he? I'm here. There is no man. And they finally turned around, but they were not happy with me running. And the reason I did it, my son was a student out there, and they wanted to start a tutorial program, and I helped them with that. And one of the guys was a popular football player, so they came and we started to I helped them start the tutorial program. Then they came to me with another problem. There was a chemistry professor, black professor, who they didn't want to grant tenure to because he would have become the first black in that department. They wanted to know what they could do. I said, well, let's go look at the state regulations and see if they did everything according to Hall. And they hadn't. So I told them to urge him to ask for an open hearing at the board meeting. And he won because they had not followed the right rules and protocol. And from that, when I read in the paper that they were seeking candidates, I decided I'm going to run for that.
Right.
And I didn't even tell my husband. I just went down there and signed up. And the first time, there were about 13 candidates. I came in behind the man that got the seat. And I thought, gee, if I did that well now, a black woman, if I work hard enough, I can get that. So for the next round, I studied the state's master plan for higher education. I had answers to questions they didn't even ask. And people were so impressed with my knowledge, I got elected. And I was the first black male or female to go on the board and serve 24 years.
Long time.
Yeah. They tried to do a lot of good stuff. Got them to establish an affirmative action committee, fought the nursing program, which didn't want to take any blacks in. They had a spot where they tried to kill off a lot of students at that point. If they made it to another point, they had some more strategies there. So we were able to break all of that down. And I had nurses come to the board meeting, black and white, supporting each other.
Nice.
And from there, they had to change some of the policies there. Still had some problems, but broke that down. And the Affirmative Action Committee came as a result of that fight.
I have a question. The sorority, as far as you being involved in the fight, did they help support, and NCNW help support you in what you were?
Yeah, a lot of the women were in the same things. Yeah, they didn't do it if they were partisan efforts. Both organizations couldn't do it if they were partisan efforts. But if they were nonpartisan efforts, they could, and they could as individual women.
Yes.
Just don't use the name of the organization.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So you, I'm kind of shifting gears a little bit, but you worked at Norton for a while.
That's the job that's the job that transferred me here.
Right, in the beginning, so in the 50s. What was kind of racial dynamics at Norton like in terms of discrimination? Did you have to fight to overcome barriers there?
Yes. Remember, they were not only transferring the people, but they were transferring the operation. This was the IBM machines that they used punch cards for and all of that. So we were trained at Wright-Patterson. We were told to go out there and train others at these other places. So I come to Norton, I'm 21 years old, and I have 3 people working under me who are way older than me. One woman was over 40, a big redhead Viking looking man was in his 30s, and I was the boss because I was training them. That was not easy. But I won them over. Yeah. A little story, one of them, I used to take my Jets and the Ebony magazines to work with me to read. They grab them before I could. This one, she read in there that a woman in Memphis, Tennessee, when the city told her she had to put in showers in her apartments, she said black folks didn't take showers. So this young white lady that worked for me, they said, "Is that right, Lois? Black people don't take showers?" I said, "Oh yeah, we just lick ourselves like cats." And after that, she knew she had done something. But yeah, I ran into it. And I quit when I got pregnant with my 3rd child. I decided to come home and be at home for a while.
How do you think Norton sort of shaped the development of the black community here in San Bernardino over the years?
Well, a lot of black people had jobs there. And my husband, when he came home from the Korean War, he got a job there. He was a purchaser, ended up being a purchaser. He worked his way up to that. And it was good. And when they closed down, it hit the black community disproportionately. Yeah. John Hobbs was an airman in the Air Force. He became a city councilman when I first came here. And when he got out, that's when he started his civilian work. But he was one of the blacks that I remember from those early days. And Harry Rubottom worked out there as well. So those are the only 2 blacks that I recall from where I was working. And I came in 52. I quit in 55 to come home and take care of kids. But Norton had its influence, definitely had an influence. And as I said, we invited wives of Air Force personnel to join Les Unamis and NCNW so that they would have something to belong to away from home.
Right.
And today, General Stacey Harris, who was in the Air Force, pilot for United Airlines, asked by George Bush to fly Air Force One, and now she's the first black woman to be appointed to the board of directors of Boeing. She was stationed out here and a member of our. Yeah, I invited her to join, and she joined. But at that time, she was a lieutenant and worked on the Marion Black.
Yeah.
You know, you've heard of Marion Black.
Yeah.
And
So-
were there events out there? Like, did Les Jeunes Amis hold events at the
Oh yeah,
officers?
we used to use the NCO club for a number of things. A couple of times we used the officers club for things because there were a couple of black officers out there by this time. And I'm trying to think of the one who is so well-known black officer. He was here at Norton for a while.
I know my dad was an officer. Mac Lawrence Harden was an officer, but I don't think they got
No, I don't
involved.
remember him.
Yeah, because it was early 60s, I think.
But General Green was, no, Colonel Green, he was very active in community. And if you ever see any histories of black officers in the military, this guy I can't think of is in there. He was at Norton for a long time.
And do you think it affected black politics in any way in the city, the connection to Norton? I sort of ask because some people have mentioned sort of that people who were in the military felt like they couldn't be involved in politics so much. And other people have mentioned, maybe Hardy Brown mentioned something about how the kind of Red Scare played out locally. So I just wondered if you had any insights
I
into
don't
that.
recall that.
Okay.
I think a lot of the military didn't get involved in politics because they knew they'd be leaving soon or it wasn't a priority. But Colonel Green was involved in community stuff, not so much the politics because that could affect his status as an officer, but is very involved in community. And they were very involved in social life of the community as well.
I wonder, now your kids didn't go to public school, but do you remember the kind of, you know, in the moment of the community mothers organizing, there was the sort of high point of the freedom schools being created. Do you remember anything about that moment when the freedom schools were happening and any memories of that?
We had one here.
Okay.
I remember they were in other places, but we never got that far here.
Yeah. I think there were, and I can't remember, maybe
Where?
65. In San Bernardino, there were some freedom schools. There was like a boycott of the schools. It may not have affected you because your kids weren't in the public schools so much.
Early on, they were not.
Yeah.
But I always believed in public education because I knew that was a promise of America from the Constitution, that because democracy required an educated electorate, education was going to be a priority. And so I believe that made a lot of sense. And even though I went to private school, had my kids in private, I always supported public education. And I think it's threatened today. I really do.
Absolutely.
But I can't recall. If it was a small operation, and it didn't last long.
I had a question a little bit about your husband that you might know the story. Francis Grice mentioned this organization called the Deacons, which kind of then, that he was a part of, I think. Not a big organization, a little group.
No, my husband was active with the West Side Action Group.
West Side Action Group.
But I don't remember the
Deacons, or the FBI, they called themselves, or the Black Fathers Incorporated.
Well, the Black Fathers preceded the West Side Action Group. Bob Parker organized both. And they transitioned from one to the other.
I see.
And my husband joined when they were the Black Father.
Do you remember anything about kind of what the Black Fathers group
The
did?
same kinds of things that the West Side Action Group did. It was mostly to fight discrimination and political purposes, trying to get people in key positions, because there was absolutely no power in the black community.
And sort of in that kind of effort to build more power, do you remember any of the other big fights? We've talked a little bit about education.
Well, when the poverty program came into town, there was a lot of, because it was like, this is power, because it required them to have low-income people involved. They had to go to black communities to do assessments, and it was like, we want this by the bushel barrels full. This is power. And they would go to the meetings, and meetings would last till 1 a.m, fighting back and forth. And Senator Ayala, decided after the federal government allowed cities and counties jurisdiction to take over community action agencies if they were in trouble. Ayala jumped at that and made it a part of the county. At that time, I used to go to those meetings, and they were wild and woolly. And I never thought at that time that I would end up working in that field, because I thought I don't want to have anything to do with this. But it was part of the body politic, so I would go to the meeting. And I remember this woman, Miss Turner. She took over the desk of the executive director and wouldn't move. They had to come and physically move her from there.
What?
It was.
Was she from Fontana?
No, I
Mrs.
think she
Turner?
was from the Musco area.
Musco.
I think.
Okay.
Not you're thinking of Jessie Turner.
Turner, right?
This was another woman.
Another Turner. Okay.
I was trying to, and the guy who was director, he left and went to Seattle and became director of some kind of federal program up there. And his wife was one of the founders of the Links. The Links here. Yeah.
So what were some of those fights about, sort of in those early years when you were going to the CAP meetings in San Bernardino?
Over what kind of programs they would have, and just actually it came down to who's got more power, and it kind of became a little unreasonable. But what the county did was even worse than what these groups who were learning how to compromise, how to lead programs, how to be community about programs. And I was working at UCR when a woman asked me to apply for a job with community action. And I said, the poverty program? Actually, Upward Bound was part of the poverty program. I didn't realize that until I got into it. But this woman asked me to apply. And I said, well, I'll have to think about that, because I'm thinking about those meetings. But I did go, and I met with the director. I applied, and I said, well, I'm going to Hawaii, so I'll have to see you when I get back, you know. And he waited and hired me, and that's how I got into it. And I spent 3 years here at San Bernardino, and then I went to Riverside, 30 years
30 years at
there.
Riverside, yeah.
So, you said Upward Bound was part of what? Do you remember what other?
Oh, yeah. Job Corps,
Okay.
community health clinics,
Yes.
Head Start.
Yes. Okay.
There were a whole bunch of it was like a suite of programs that covered every aspect of American life that were part of the poverty program. It was called the Economic Opportunity Act at that time.
And what are some of the early programs and organizations that were involved here in San Bernardino?
And there's still a lot of them
Yeah.
involved. Job Corps is still here.
Yeah.
Head Start is still
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Community Health Clinic, the only one that survived is down on Valley Boulevard in Bloomington.
Okay.
Community Health Clinic.
Upward Bound.
Yeah.
Upward Bound is at Cal State and UC Riverside.
And so did the CAP help start all those different programs here locally?
Yes, and in San Bernardino, when Ayala took over the CAP, they moved Head Start out, and it became a separate deal.
Right.
Why did they decide to do that? I'm sorry.
I think they wanted to give it to the schools, but the community fought that because schools weren't doing a good job with the kids they had. So why start early at age 5? And so they made it a separate organization, but they took it from the CAP.
But why did he, maybe tell us a little bit more about why he wanted to take it over and have it run by the county instead of run by the community?
Because of the money. They wanted all the money coming to. It was always about the money. It wasn't about the program. It was mostly about the money. And even in Riverside, that's the one thing I had to fight a lot. Because when I first went there, they wanted to take the first funding that I was the first director there. And they wanted to take that and buy computers for the county. And I said, I threw the book at them. I said, you can't do this. And I called San Bernardino and said, I might be coming back because they may fire me after this. But they didn't. They listened to the rules and didn't do that.
That is not a poverty program.
No, this money's supposed to go to poor people in the community.
Right.
Yeah. But it was a lot of things that I had to, but I always used the regulations, chapter and verse, to fight. And I remember McCandless, Al McCandless from the desert, who was chairman of the board. He said, I don't like this program. It's pork barrel and boondoggle, and his jaws just shook. He was trying to think of some more bad things to say. I said, sir, I'm going to change your mind. Well, it has ended up, he went to Congress and became one of our biggest supporters there. Yeah. But you had to do things right and according to the rules. And if once you laid the rules on them, I mean, these are elected people, they are educated people, they know. And when I would tell them gently, it was not, boorish, they listened. Yeah. And I would do something to prove that I could do this job.
In some of the CAPs in other cities and counties that I know of, a lot of sort of civil rights activism would come out of the CAPs
Oh
meetings.
yes, civil rights movement was a twin legislation along with the EOA, the Economic Opportunity Act, and the Civil Rights Act were twin actions under Lyndon Baines Johnson. So it's definitely tied to it. And the civil rights side said you do advocacy. Some people thought that advocacy was politicking, but there's a difference. And advocacy was in the law itself.
And so in those early days, both in Riverside and San Bernardino, what were some of the local advocacy groups that kind of came out of that, mix? Out of those giant meetings where people were fighting for power. Do you remember any of were there any local groups that sort of came out of that and grew?
In San Bernardino, there weren't a lot there were individuals who were involved with community action and civil rights, but I don't remember any organization. Well, I guess the Black Fathers and the WAG, but I can tell you NCNW did not come from that perspective. The sororities and fraternities, no. But in Riverside, there were a few who, the NAACP by this time had come into existence, so they were always about that. But in Riverside, they had groups and people, and this guy got elected to the city council in Riverside. His son is now an attorney with Best and Krieger. I'm having a hard time with names, but when they come to me, I'll write them down for you so I can get back to you. But Riverside was a little bit, we were more active over here, but Riverside was a little bit more organized over there. Yeah.
So a little
Fair
more
housing came about as a result of community action. I read the regulations for the Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, and it said wherever you had federal funds coming in, you had to have a fair housing council. Riverside County didn't have one. So I took it to the Board of Supervisors because I wanted the public to hear me say this. And I said to the board, here are the regs. It says we should have a fair housing council, and community action is proposing that you let us run a fair housing council. Well, the guy from CDBG, he didn't like that. And he was determined that if we got to do this, you're not going to get it. So they put it with the housing authority. Didn't work out there. So they made it a separate, complete organization, and Rose Mays is director of it over there now.
Yeah.
Mhm. But that came about as a result of community action advocating for it.
And as a result of you reading the regulations carefully.
And saying, this is what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. How did you see sort of CAP change over the years that you worked in it? Both in Riverside, but also you probably observed. Yeah.
Became more professional and less grassroots. Because I tell you, and those people did a great job. They had no training. Some of them were not even, well, they weren't highly educated because they were very grassroots people. But they could see that there was a promise in this program somehow. And so today you got more MBAs and folks like that. And we have our internal training program to bring people up through the ranks. You may start down here, but we got a pathway for you to go up, because we still have a requirement to hire the poor wherever we can. And a lot of agencies weren't doing that, but in Riverside we tried to do that. But that's how I see the difference. And the energy programs that you see today, weatherization and all of those kinds of things, that came out of CAP. Those were ideas that CAP proposed when they found in the Northeast people were choosing heating over eating, and they didn't have enough money to do both. That's when we came up with the program to weatherize homes. And so there are a lot of programs that today exist because of community action.
Okay.
Well, I was going to ask about, gosh, this is so fascinating, all of the building up and everything that happened. And then Norton closed down.
And March partially closed down.
Yes.
Both of them have an adverse effect on the black community.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Because my heart breaks when I think about that, because the effect was so drastic.
Well, so back in Washington, they decided to downsize the military throughout the country. They looked around the country and saw which ones would be less traumatic. Well, no, I shouldn't put it that way. Which one would encounter less opposition? Because there were certain states and jurisdictions that they weren't going to touch anything because it was so powerful. So they went looking for the vulnerable areas where they could shut down things without encountering a lot of opposition. That's why March is still around, but it was, I would say, 50% reduced. Norton was closed entirely because there weren't as much. There was power here, but for some reason I think it was different than in Riverside, because San Bernardino has always been more political than Riverside, but it didn't seem to work the same way. And having worked for Riverside County and living in this county, I was able to kind of compare the way things worked in the two counties. Because they used to never speak to each other. I mean, Riverside thought they were much more sophisticated and highbrow, and these were just mud on the boots kind of people.
That's interesting. There are a lot of big changes, economic changes, physical changes in the city of San Bernardino, particularly over the years. I wonder how you saw things like the building of the freeways and the redevelopment in the city affecting the community.
Oh, that was definitely tied to discrimination.
Yeah, tell me.
That freeway cut the west side off from the rest of the city. And I can remember when they put the freeway in, and there was a lot of protest about that, and it really affected the west side economically.
So you were telling us what you remember when the freeway cut through.
Right. It cut off businesses because people on the other side, on F and G, they used to come over into this area. There were certain businesses. There was the Boys Club. There were things that they came for that just shut down a lot of that. And it was after that that the banks left, Safeway left.
Yes.
Safeway had a lot of black and Hispanic workers. At the bank had blacks working at the bank. I can remember Ada Sims was her name, worked at the bank. So you could see yourself in these different places.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it had a really adverse effect.
Yeah. And how about the other kind of redevelopment efforts? I know there were some efforts to redevelop the West Side, but also to redevelop downtown, tear down old buildings, build new ones.
The redevelopment, there were a lot of blacks that used to live down on South D Street and Arrowhead. Bonnie Johnson was raised in that area down there. When they built the Central City Mall, they put all these people out and moved them over to the West Side on California Gardens, into California Gardens. Yeah, that's when they built California Gardens to take all those people who were coming from downtown San Bernardino and move them over there. They didn't get the kind of money they should have gotten for their property, especially since it was going to be downtown now. And these houses were not up to snuff, really. So yeah, that was another bold act of discrimination. And power.
What year?
Warner Hodgkin was very involved in all of that.
Who was?
Warner Hodgkin, who built that golf course up on the,
Yeah, I know where you're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't know the street.
not Arrowhead, but the other golf course in San Bernardino. He was a very wealthy man, and he was involved with the downtown redevelopment.
And did a lot of those folks like Bonnie Johnson's family own their own homes down there?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
All the people from the Valley Truck Farm that I was telling you about into that area in South San Bernardino, all those people owned their homes. They weren't renters.
Yeah.
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 The only rent, they didn't even build any public housing in that area. They built the first public housing down on 9th Street in
That's
San
where it
Bernardino.
is, yeah.
And, yeah.
Ninth and what?
9th and Mount Vernon.
That was the first one?
No, 9th and not Mount Vernon.
Muscat.
West Muscat.
Okay.
What was Muscat? Now
Yes.
Medical Center
Right.
Drive.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the first public housing built in, and Waterman Gardens.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And do you remember when those were built? What were the...
No, they were here when I
They
came.
were here when you came, okay.
Yeah.
Right. And then, but California Gardens was built more in the 50s.
California Gardens came along with redevelopment.
Yeah.
That was after 1964 and
Right.
all of those programs, CDBG,
Right.
Community Action, all of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And yeah, redevelopment was part of CDBG.
And was CAP part of the kind of organize any protests around that? Or
Oh no, CAP didn't
No.
organize any protests
Right.
around that. See, when San Bernardino got it, it went to the city and to the county. Those funds went to the city and county, and CAP had nothing
Nothing.
to do with that.
Okay, right.
They were busy trying to keep what they had in the Economic Opportunity Act.
Yeah.
I have a question about blacks and Latinos, because I remember you said when you used to live close to St. Anthony's, there were Latino families, but they moved and it became...
No,
No,
it's
they were
all
still
Mexican
there?
now.
Yeah, it is. But for a while...
Pretty
wasn't
much,
it-
yeah.
Wasn't it all black at one point and then they moved back, or it
No.
they just...
The houses west of Western Avenue,
Uh-huh.
there were more blacks that bought into that.
Right.
But on the east side of Western Avenue,
Mm-hmm.
where I lived, there were more Mexicans in that area. There were some blacks. On Trenton, there were more blacks. It was just a really mixed neighborhood.
Right.
And I enjoyed living there. I only moved because we needed a bigger house with 6 children.
And so now, though, it's predominantly all, even where I grew up, it's all Latino now.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
guess that's
Well, the population as a whole
Yes.
is more Latinos even than
That's
whites.
true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
But that's also another big shift as some sort of successful desegregation of housing opened up in Rialto, and communities sort of,
Yeah.
those boundaries weren't as hard. The black community on the west side began moving to different
areas.
places. How have you
Right.
sort of seen, how has that affected the community on the west side that you remember, and the politics and the, the community organizing?
Well, now it all looks about the same, whether you're talking Rialto or West Side San Bernardino.
That's true.
It
That's
all
true.
kind of looks back about the same, because it was just a natural for blacks on that side of the wash to move this way. But at this point, you got a whole bunch of blacks on the east side, in Highland, in North Redlands, Del Rosa area. I think it's probably more integrated, but the population is primarily Hispanic.
Hispanic, yeah.
Yeah.
Looking,
All my
yeah.
that house is black, that house is Mexican, this house is Mexican, that house is black, that house is black, next house is Mexican.
Yeah.
It's mixed up.
It's mixed up, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But not a lot of white folks.
No.
Oh,
No.
there's
yeah.
some near the terrace over in that, and they've been there a long time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that pattern of white flight kind of continued through Rialto and other
Yeah,
communities.
yeah.
Yeah.
Rialto is Rialto had the distinction in the 70s or 80s of having the most affluent blacks. One of the cities having the most affluent black in America.
Interesting.
Oh. Wow.
At one time.
Yeah.
But I'm not in Rialto.
Right. But your kids went to the Rialto
One block
school.
over.
We're in the Rialto
Right.
School District,
Yeah.
but in the city of San Bernardino.
Right.
That's called conflicting jurisdictions.
Yes.
Gerrymandering is what it was.
Oh,
When
okay.
they built these houses, these kids would have had to go down to Franklin High School. So they put them in the Rialto School District.
Okay. Yeah.
So that was a sort of,
Gerrymandering.
right, racial gerrymandering. in that
Yeah,
case,
racial
right.
gerrymandering. That's exactly what it
interesting.
was.
Interesting. You were talking a little bit earlier about your son's experiences at Eisenhower. So they were in a kind of first wave of African American kids in Eisenhower?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But they prevailed. He was in madrigals and played sports there. The next son became student body president, joined the ski club, and he was probably the first black in this area to know how to ski. And my youngest daughter, when she was at Myers, we used to talk when I'd comb her hair in my bathroom, and she'd tell me things. She was telling me about this book that they were reading in her first grade class called Nicodemus and Friends. And that guy, what is that?
Yeah.
I said, well, you bring that book home. Don't tell your teacher. Just don't bother her. Just bring it on home and so Mama can see it. It was classic discrimination. Nicodemus and his friend, they ate watermelon and then they had to take a nap. In the fly of the book, it said, this book should be right up there in the window of the pet store. It was awful.
Ooh.
I went to the school and I went to the principal and I said, that book should not be, this is we're in the civil rights era, and no book like this should be in the schools nowadays. He agreed. Not only did he take it out of Myers, got him to take it out of every school in the Rialto School District. So we had a lot of stuff like that. So then we organized parents to go to the school and demand Black history be taught.
Yes.
And they came to me and asked me to be the leader. I said, now when it gets hot and heavy, I don't want you coming back shooting at me. But remember, you asked me to do this. Well, we did, and we asked for a Black history class and a Black person to teach it.
Yes.
And we went to the school board meeting, several meetings, and this one woman said, there's no such thing as Black history. You read one book and that's it. And that was so ignorant, I couldn't even answer that. But anyway, we won. We got the class, we got the teacher, wrong teacher. And we told them, don't hire that man. He came to his interview, fly dress, and he identified too much with the students. Turned a whole bunch of students into people they should not have been.
Yeah.
Violated rules, had dances when they told him not to do those kinds of things. He didn't listen to the parents, and you know, that didn't work out.
Yeah.
We saved the program, and we finally got rid of him. Yeah, but they didn't let us be a part of the final interview and selection.
Yeah.
Right.
If they had, we wouldn't have had that problem.
Yeah.
But they thought they was giving us too much power if they let us do that.
Right. And do they still have Black History courses?
Oh
know?
yeah, they probably still do. My kids have been out of school
Right.
a long
A
time.
while.
I'm sure they have something. Now they're fighting over all the Black History stuff that's coming out now. Critical thinking. What is that?
Critical
They're
race
probably
theory.
fighting over that
Yeah.
nowadays. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I want to ask just, we've talked about a lot of campaigns and kind of struggles against discrimination that you were involved in. Are there any sort of big struggles we haven't talked about that you think are really important? Maybe for jobs or for any, you know, campaigns around the police or the firefighters that you remember, that you have any stories about?
No, nothing that big other than the kinds of things that I've told you about. Couple of achievements in both Riverside and San Bernardino is the erection of the statues of Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yes.
Reverend Wetzel was her name, that had the vision of seeing a statue of King in front of City Hall in San Bernardino.
Yeah.
And she called me to ask if I would help with them. And they were doing spaghetti dinners
Yes.
every Friday night, and that wasn't going to cut it. So I went to Mayor Holcomb and said, she came to City Council. You approved her building a statue there, but you did tell her you weren't going to put any money into it. The city wasn't.
Right.
But they're not going to make it selling spaghetti dinners.
Right.
So I said, you need to name a committee of some prestigious people to help her do this. And they will raise the money, and the city won't have to do that.
Yes.
Be careful what you suggest, because he named me as a co-chair of that committee. And the president of the Santa Fe Federal Bank as the other co-chair. And that's when we started to raise the money to build the statue. We raised enough to maintain the statue for 15 years beyond its erection. And Francis Grice was in charge of the group that refurbished the statue 15 years later when the money ran out. Well, as a result of that, Rose Mays, who is over the Fair Housing Council, came to me and said, we want to build a statue of King too. So I just was advisor to their group, and that statue in front of City Hall has 2 children with Dr. King on it. So I thought those were real achievements in cities like Riverside and San Bernardino. And our statue here, and I visited everywhere they got a statue of King in the United States.
Oh.
None of them has captured the features like ours does.
Wow.
None of them. We found the sculpture in Mexico, and I'm thinking, Mexico? I'm seeing big pots sitting on the corner, but that man turned out to be maestro. He had done statues of Benito Juarez, of the head of Nicaragua, and he has stuff in the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. I said, oh, we have definitely got to, and he did it for us at a discount because he loved Dr. King. And
That was beautiful.
That's lovely.
Yes.
and when they brought it, and it was laying down at the city yard, and I looked at it and I thought, oh, wow. But then when they hoisted it into place,
Yes.
I said, good grief, this is beautiful. You know, it was really something. And the next day somebody threw paint on it, and they had to clean that off before we had the dedication.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we didn't have any major
Yeah.
kinds of things.
Yeah. You mentioned Holcomb. It sounds like when I start to read the history a little bit that Holcomb had a very different relationship with Black community activists than Ballard, say, did before him.
Oh, Ballard was the pits.
Do you-
His wife always wore the same dress to Black events. We called it her colored folks dress. Ballard put the guys on top of the building with guns
Yeah. Tell us about that.
during the riots. The building, I remember the building at Medical Center Drive and Baseline. Those little businesses in there.
Yes.
He put police with guns on top of those to quell anything I thought was going to happen in the Black community.
Okay.
But Holcomb was just the opposite.
Yeah.
Holcomb was a very good mayor. He could have been mayor for life. But and he was the one that started a committee of whites and blacks to try to resolve some of and to get to know one another. And I remember telling them, you have one faction of the white community that's not in this group, and you need to have them here. Poor white folk. They're the ones who are upset, and you need to, and they're upset because you don't pay them any attention until you need them to vote against them Black. That's the only time they have any value to you. And they listened, and we had a pretty good committee. That's where I met Hardy Brown. He was appointed to that committee as well.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what that committee was and what
Well,
it
it was
did?
to promote conversation between Blacks and white, answer the questions that you've always had and never asked, do it in a spirit of goodwill, try not to become defensive, try not to insult each other, but just keep the dialogue going. And it was pretty good. And we had people from different organizations and individuals, League of Women Voters, I remember they were there, Rotary, Kiwanis, representatives of those organizations, and Black organizations, Hispanic organizations. And it lasted as long as Holcomb lasted.
Okay.
And I can't remember the mayor that followed Holcomb.
What was it called, that group? Do you remember?
It was, I think it was Community Relations Committee. That's what it was called, Community Relations. But its purpose was dialogue between the different factions of it.
And Ballard putting people up on the buildings, was that during the uprising?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
The Watts riots had occurred,
Yes.
and that was his response to making sure nothing like that happened out here.
Yes.
And how did the community respond to that? What kinds of...
Just blew up. Didn't like it. Told him to get him down, and he did.
And he did? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. We also...
That would have caused more
Yes.
problems.
We also heard stories about guns on the fire trucks at some point. Was that at the same time period?
Probably
later?
was,
Right. Yeah.
but I can't recall that personally. I don't.
I
Okay.
think it was sure
Yeah.
around. So
Yeah.
it probably was just a different
Probably,
Yeah.
downtown.
Yeah.
Probably.
I know.
maybe.
Yeah.
But that was the only big confrontational thing I remember from that time.
Yeah. We're living through a moment of Black Lives Matter protests, and people again kind of raising the question about whether we have achieved racial justice. What's it like for you to be living through this moment? What is you thinking and feeling as you live through this moment, having also been involved in all these struggles in
Here
the
we
past?
go again. And same kind of reaction. I don't know what it's going to take for whites to get over their fear. It's fear that makes them react like that. And they could take a lesson from South Africa.
Yeah.
South Africa is way ahead, and they had apartheid that was just as bad
Worse.
as slavery, because those people were enslaved in their own land.
Yes.
But because Mandela had this forgiveness thing, discussion, community dialogues right after, before positions hardened, they were able to make a lot of progress. Now they have problems like any community, but they are much farther along in terms of race relations because they faced what they had done, admitted to what they had done.
Yeah.
White America never admitted.
Right.
Yeah.
And even now, critical race theory, which is another way of trying to avoid
They
that.
want to make a fairy tale out of history. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was an awful experience, you know. And slavery is America's original sin. It's in the Constitution. Blacks are 3/5 of a person. Takes 5 blacks to make one person. Or 3 blacks to make one person.
Yeah.
It's just, and till we can get past that, and the longer we wait, 200 years, and we still, I don't know that we'll really ever get over it. Maybe it's terminal. And a lot of what we're going through now, where democracy is threatened, I don't know.
What?
Yeah?
Billups and Friend.
I'm sorry.
Colonel Billups and Colonel Friend.
Oh, you were trying
Colonel
to remember.
Billups
Colonel Billups
And Robert Friend.
and Robert
and
Friend.
Robert Friend, they were officers at Northern.
Oh.
And I was trying to think of that other one. He had a nickname, like Hap or something like that, but I can't think of it. But anyway, Colonel Robert Friend and Rufus Billups were officers,
I see.
and both of them became. Billups became a general.
Oh.
He had been a Tuskegee Airman to start with.
Wow.
Yeah.
What sort of lessons would you want to give to younger generations of activists working today, kind of as you have worked much of your life? Any lessons you would give to them?
Well, I work with Black Future Leaders, and the whole idea was to have the students, of course, do their best, but discover themselves and their best, and what comes naturally and what you have to nurture along, and learn to achieve not by chance, but by choice. And those are the kinds of things that we did, and it's been very successful. The predominance of those students have gone on to college, and they have to do community service so that they learn to give back, learn what the problems are in the community. We would have activities when we brought them to college to live on campus for a little while. We would expose them to government, theater, all kinds of different experiences, because whether they came from almost middle class Black families or impoverished families, they pretty much all had the same experience of not doing a lot of the stuff that we provided to them. And the choice chance thing was prevalent in both groups. Yeah. Because the almost middle class families were so busy working and taking care of things, they didn't have time for a lot of stuff, so we provided that. And we made the fees low enough so low income people could preserve their dignity and maybe pay. And if they couldn't, then we paid for the students.
Yeah.
But that's been a pretty successful program. And we never had any paid staff. It's totally volunteer.
Any last question?
I'm so full
Yeah.
of everything you shared.
Me
This
too.
is- my goodness, this is part of what I've been looking for. Is I've been, accompanying the interviews, and I'm not a part of what.
Yeah, you are.
But I'm doing it for the poetry book that I'm writing about growing up in San Bernardino. And after my mom passed, I started trying to collect memories. And some of my memories, like renaming the library Mary McLeod Bethune Library, I said, I got some research to do.
Yeah.
And we met because I was looking for a book that would help me fill it in.
Mary McLeod, it's McLeod.
Okay.
McLeod founded the National Council of Negro Women.
Yes.
She was the first woman to advise 4 presidents, Black woman, 4 presidents, starting with Roosevelt.
Yes.
She founded Bethune-Cookman College,
Yes.
and I went down there for the 100th anniversary of the college because she was the founder of NCNW. And just an amazing woman.
Yes.
I mean, born into slavery. And
I knew her life story, and for some reason, I don't know if her picture was in that library. I used to walk over to that library all the time, and I just renamed it because I must have heard my mom talking about NCNW and Bethune, and so when I renamed it the Mary Kellogg Library, the Mary, I said I got a lot of research to fill in the blanks.
I think that's beautiful because it's sort of like a kid sort of doing the renaming.
do your own thing, that's right.
Like I'm going to make this the person who I'm looking up to. So
Well, the National Council of Negro Women has been one of the highlights of my life, being a member of that. And I'm so glad that we disbanded Les Unamis to do this. I served on the national board for years. I was first vice president, went to Africa with the National Council of Negro Women.
Right.
Oh, we went to Egypt. We went to West Africa as NCNW. And I was first vice president. We went there, and we were hosted by the president of Senegal, and got to go and see what women organizations were doing there. And I have a dress that the Senegalese women made for all of us for our final night together.
Wow.
Then we went to Egypt, and we were hosted by Egyptian women, and we left a section in both of these places after we left. They formed a we don't call them chapters, we call them sections. We formed it, and I got to introduce Mrs. Mubarak at our opening session in Egypt. She was the wife of the president.
Yes.
Wow.
The government put a car at our disposal with flying the flags of Egypt and America, and we drove up to Alexandria, and it was just amazing.
Were there other people from the chapters here who went along with you?
Oh yeah, Amina was on that trip.
Amina was on that trip.
Amina
right.
was on that trip.
Yes.
And a couple of other people from the Inland Empire, Mildred Tyler, who worked at UCR. Yeah, there were quite a few.
Yeah.
And in Senegal, when we went that year, that was just people who were selected. Well, first of all, when we went to Mexico, you remember the United Nations Decade for Women?
Oh, yes.
We went to Mexico. That was the very first one, 1975.
Wow.
We met African women who told us they never get to meet black women when they come to the United States because it's white women that host them.
Oh, my goodness.
And they never, so Dr. Height said, well, we'll fix that.
Right.
And we wrote a grant to the State Department and asked them to help us bring women, and they brought women from Togo and Senegal, West Africa.
Yes.
Dr. Height sent out a notice to local sections saying, write up what you would do if these people came to visit you in your area. I wrote up the proposal for us, and we got selected. I had Cal State and Valley College translate everything we had into French,
Yes.
because both of those countries are French speaking.
Yes.
And I got selected to reciprocate the visit. That's how I got to go
Oh, my goodness.
with them. And the government of Senegal put a plane at our disposal to fly us to the Casamance region where these women had this farm project that they wanted us to see. And we visited other things while we were there. But NCNW has really been an experience.
Now you more than, because Amina talked to me about joining the NCNW, and I said, I'm going to do it. And hearing you talk about it, I'm definitely going to do it, like, as soon as I get home, I'm going to do it. My goodness. And I wish I had known this earlier. I wish I had known this earlier.
Well, it's not too late to join. We're still
Exactly.
very active. And they got one in Pomona, one in San Gabriel. These are sections. Yeah.
And when the women came from Senegal and Togo, you said?
Togo.
What did you do with them here?
Well, we showed them community action. We took them to various events and things. We had a big party for them at Nan Clopton's house in Rialto. Took them to colleges so that they could see that. I was wearing a big natural at that time. And one of the women from Senegal liked my natural. I took her to
So she
my
could do
barber,
natural.
lady barber,
Uh-huh.
who cut her hair the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about how we could have a beauty shop over in Senegal that could do that.
Oh.
It was, yeah, just great. I've been to Africa 9 times.
Wow.
What countries? I'm sorry.
Senegal 2 or 3 times.
Mhm.
The Gambia, we went up to the place where Ellis Haley found his ancestors.
Okay. Yes.
Up the Gambia River to Gambia.
Yes.
Nigeria,
Yes.
Ghana,
Yes.
Sierra Leone,
Mhm.
Swaziland, South Africa, Zimbabwe.
Mhm.
Now, some of them I've gone to more than once.
Right.
Yes.
That's what makes the
Yeah.
night. But those,
Ah,
every Black American should go to Africa.
absolutely. I
Why?
want to go to Ghana.
Will you tell us a little more why? I mean, so why is it important?
That's the source
Mhm.
of it, you know, and you learn so much. I watch the people and their mannerisms and their behaviors, and I remember standing in my hotel room looking out these men down on the street level,
Mhm.
and I said, yeah, these are my people.
Yes.
Mannerisms, the women fall out laughing just like we do,
Yes.
and it's just really something. And then you study a lot. I have had my ancestry done 2 or 3 times.
Ah.
Yeah, so I know
From what regions?
the-
Yeah.
the largest percentage is Ghanaian,
That's what I think.
but other parts there's even Native American. I was surprised about that.
Mm.
Little bit of European, and that would be from my dad's side, and it was just amazing. I learned that certain words and foods and things that we eat. Egypt. Got to tell you about when we were not in Egypt, Kenya. We were in Nairobi, another Decade for Women conference, and I was coming back from the university to my hotel,
Mhm.
and the driver, I was talking with my driver, and we passed a field of corn. I said, "What do you call that?" He said, "Maize." I said, "Well, we call it corn." And I said, "How do you, prepare it?"
Mhm.
And he started describing ways, and he said, "Ugali." And when he did, I said, "Oh, that sounds like cornbread. We do that."
Ah.
And then he said, "Uji." These are Swahili words.
Yes.
That was grits.
Oh my goodness.
And then he said, "We like to eat the ugali with the skumi wiki." And he described skumi wiki, and that sounded like greens. So when I got back to my hotel, I raced down to the market. I said, "Show me skumi wiki." They held up collard greens.
Ah.
We eat that same food and a lot of the things that they have, and peanuts.
Oh, is in
That
everything.
definitely. That's
Yes.
and the word in Wolof in Senegal for peanut is guba. We say goober here, but guba is what they call it there.
Yes, yes,
Bubba is a boy child in Wolof, and everybody's Bubba over here. I
Right.
had a younger brother that we call Bubba. So you learn that some of these things have come, and we always thought that there was nothing African that was.
And there it is.
The one thing I'm glad they didn't bring here was sitting around this big bowl, everybody eating out of the bowl with.
You know, they still do that in Atlanta when I lived in Georgia, and I would visit and we would still.
Well, the
do that,
Ethiopians
yes.
do that too,
Mhm.
but in Senegal, it's a national law that children have to be taught in these orphanages run by Westerners.
Yeah.
They have to be taught to eat communally
Right.
like that. It's in the
Yes.
law. You have to teach the children to eat like that.
It's almost like, in the Catholic Church we have communion, but there it's, the community, that communal eating and making sure that.
Right,
yes,
right,
yeah.
right. And I was determined I was going to get into one of these huts to see what they looked like
Uh-huh.
inside when we went out to the countryside.
Uh-huh.
They were just like our houses. Some were clean, messy. Some was spectacular. Rugs on the floor, furniture, and I never thought that that's what I would see in one of those. But they had the cooking hut where all the pots were up top, so the animals wouldn't
Oh, okay.
get to the pots.
Yes.
And they cook as a group, and everybody eats
As a
together.
Yes.
Mhm.
Okra, I understand, is.
Oh yeah,
another
that's
thing.
an
Yes.
African word.
Yes.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Well, this is so.
Oh, and
lovely.
ninny. You ever heard the word, the
I've
term
heard-
ninny and
yeah.
ninny jug?
Yeah. What
Down south they call the breast is the ninny jug, the ninny is the milk.
Oh, okay.
That's a
Okay.
that's a Wolof word.
It's a Wolof word.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, now I know.
And people down south use that all
Yes,
the
they
time. I
do.
grew up with that.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is so great. We could probably talk all day, but
Yeah,
maybe we
yeah.
should stop and say thank you so much for sharing stories with us. It's been really, really lovely.
You're certainly welcome.